Hi everyone, in today's lesson we're going to write trig equations given a trig graph. So the first thing we need to do is explain the components of a trig equation. So we could either have a sine graph or a cosine graph. So let's just say we have a sine. The form of the equation will be f of x equals a sine bx plus or minus d. And we could have a cosine graph, and it would be written the same way. It would just be f of x equals a cos bx, and then plus or minus d. So we just need to define what each of these letters represent. So the absolute value of a will be your amplitude. The b value will be your number of cycles. Sometimes that's referred to as your frequency. And the d value will be your vertical shift, or in other words, your midline. Okay, if we are going plus d, that means we are going up. And if we are going down d units, that means, if we have a minus d, that means we're going to go down. So here are the two formulas that we're going to use when writing our trig graphs. So I'm going to give you a picture now, and I'm going to ask you to write the equation, and the equation should be in this form. So before we can even go into graphing them, I need you to write down these next four graphs. So remember, this is what our sine graph looks like. It starts at the midline, goes up, down, up. Our negative sine graph still starts at the midline, but goes down, up, down. So it's important to know what these graphs look like, because when you make an equation, you're going to need to know if it's a sine or a negative sine graph. So take a moment and pause the video and jot down these two equations, two graphs, as well as some key notes, where they start and the direction in which they go. Okay, now that you've written down the sine graphs, I'd like you to do the same thing for the cos graphs. Remember, positive cosine graph starts at the max, a negative cosine graph starts at the min. See up here, we're starting at the max, we're going down. Here we're starting at the min, and we're going down. So again, pause the video and then hit resume once you have it all written down. Okay, so now that you have all that written down, we should be able to write an equation given a graph. So here's example number 1. Again, take a minute, pause the video, jot the picture down, and then hit resume when you're ready for the explanation. So we need to write the equation of this line. So the first thing we need to do is find the equation of the midline. So I'm going to put this down in steps on the side. So step 1, find the midline. And we know the midline is in the middle of the max and the min. So all we'll have to do is take the max value plus the min value and divide it by 2, taking the average of those highest and lowest values, and that will give us that midline. Okay, so it's y equals, because the midline is always an equation, y equals. So let's do that. So it's clear that the maximum value up here is 2, right? That's the highest the graph goes. And it's clear that the lowest the graph goes is negative 2. So we would do 2 for the max plus negative 2 for the min and divide by 2. So we know 2 plus negative 2 is 0. 0 divided by anything is 0. So that tells us where our midline is. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw it in here dotted. And this is y equals 0, and this is my midline. Once you have the midline, then you can find the amplitude. So step 2 will be find the amplitude. And the way that we find the amplitude is we just count from the midline to the max or the midline to the min. So if this is the max value here and the midline is the line in blue, from here to here would be my amplitude, or from here to here would also be my amplitude. Remember that amplitude is the absolute value. So what is the distance from this midline here to this maximum value? Well, the maximum value is at 2, and this is at 0, so 0 to 2. So my amplitude, we can just go ahead and write here that the amplitude is equal to 2. Now that we have the amplitude, the third thing that we want to do is find the number of cycles or the frequency. And remember, frequency or cycles is how many complete rotations you see between 0 and 2 pi. So I'm just going to write that down in parentheses. So what you see between 0 and 2 pi. So here's where I'm going to use my highlighter, and I'm going to look and highlight over the graph. So first, we've started the graph here, and it's going up. So we know that it's a sine graph because it starts at the midline, and it's going up and down and up. So this is one cycle. We have to keep going until we hit 2 pi. So there's one cycle. And then if we keep going, here's another cycle. But take a look, we're ending here at 2 pi. And that's exactly what I want to know. I want to know how many full cycles I see between 0 and 2 pi. So I have one in green and then one in yellow. So that's 2 full cycles. So that frequency here, or b value in the equation, is also 2. So now we can just put it all together. So we have y equals a. Now we know it's sine bx plus or minus d. So our a value is our amplitude. Our amplitude is 2, and the graph goes at the origin and goes up. So we know it's a positive 2 because it's a positive sine graph. So y equals 2 sine. B is the value of my frequency, which happens to be 2 as well. And plus or minus D, D is my vertical shift or my midline. So my midline is 0, which means I'm at the origin, so I would just have to write plus 0. So my final answer, y equals or f of x is appropriate, either way is fine. 2 sine 2x would be the equation of this graph. All right, let's try another example. Same 3 steps to get to the answer. All right, so step 1, find the midline. And remember, the midline is the same thing as the vertical shift, which is the same thing as the d value in the equation. So we can find it by taking the max plus min divided by 2. So the max is 1, the min is -1. So 1 plus -1 divided by 2. Well, 1 plus -1 is 0. 0 divided by anything is 0. So that tells me my midline is right smack in the middle. At the line, y equals 0. From the midline, we can calculate my amplitude. So step 2, amplitude. So remember, amplitude is the distance from the maximum to the midline, or the minimum to the midline. So you could tell this maximum, I kind of drew it off center here, but my maximum is up here at 1. So here to here is my distance of my amplitude. Same thing here, from here to here is my distance of my amplitude, both being 1 or -1. So when we write down the amplitude, we remember we write it as the absolute value. So my amplitude, the a value, here is 1. My third thing I want to find is the cycles or the frequency. And the frequency is the amount of cycles you see between 0 and 2 pi. So in this example, we first have to decide, is it a cosine graph or is it a sine graph? Well, where does it start? So if we take our tracer and our highlighter, it's starting up here at the maximum and it's going down. So we know that if it starts at the maximum, it's a cosine graph. And we want to know how many cycles we see between 0 and 2 pi. Well, notice 2 pi ends right here. So I have yet to complete that full cycle, right? Remember, a cosine graph starts at the top and looks like a U. And all I have in this example is half a U. It just goes from here to here. So how many cycles do I see from 0 to 2 pi? I see 1/2 of a cycle. So that is my b value in my equation. So remember, when we are writing our equation, we can write it as y equals a, this time it's cosine bx plus or minus d. A is the amplitude, so my amplitude here is 1, cosine. B is my frequency here is 1/2 x, And my midline, D, or my vertical shift, is 0, so plus 0. So if I want to write it nice with f of x, we can say it's 1, we don't need to write the 1, is cos a half x. And that is my equation of the second example. All right, let's try another one. Okay, same three things. Step 1, let's find the equation of the midline, or other words, the vertical shift, or the d value in the equation. How do we do that? We take the max plus the min divided by 2. So it's clear the maximum values here are reaching 2. The minimum values are -4. So 2 plus -4 divided by 2. 2 plus -4 is -2. -2 divided by 2 is -1. So the equation of my midline here is at -1. So it's going to be this line right here. And I'm going to go ahead and label this with y equals -1. Okay, so we've got our midline. Second thing is now we can find our amplitude. So we just have to count. Amplitude is the distance from one of the maxes to the midline, or one of the midline to the minimum. So if we calculate this distance from here to here, it looks like it's from -1 to 4. So if I count the spaces, it's 1, 2, 3. Let's check up here. 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Amplitude here, A value is 3. Third thing, we have to find the number of cycles, or the frequency. And again, that's how many complete rotations we see between 0 and 2 pi. That's what we're looking for. So let's take out our highlighter and start. Let's see what the graph is. Graph starts here, starting at 0, and it's starting at the minimum value. So the minimum value is here. Here's 1 cycle. Here's 2 cycles between 0 and 2 pi. 2 pi is where I start. It's starting at the minimum value. Therefore, this is a negative cosine graph. So we've got y equals a cos bx plus or minus d for my equation. So y equals, my amplitude is 3, but since this is a negative cosine graph, we need a -3. So -3 cos, b is the amount of frequencies or cycles that we have, and here we have 2. So we're going to put 2 in for the b. And the midline is down here at -1, and that is my d value, my vertical shift. So all I'm going to do is put -1. So you could write f of x equals, or you could just leave it like this, and that is fine. That is my equation. All right, that's it for today. Please make sure you go back and jot down and take good notes and ask us in class tomorrow if you have any questions. All right, have a good night.